Hello, my friends. This is a sermon for the second week of Easter, a sermon on the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 19 to 31. Grace, peace, and mercy are yours from the triune God. Amen. An open letter to Thomas, the disciple. Dear Thomas, I bring you greetings from a fellow follower of Jesus from the year 2020. Yes, the Jesus movement that you had a hand in starting is still going over 2,000 years after you and Jesus and the other disciples were last together in Judea. The band of Christians to which I belong just celebrated together the resurrection of your friend Jesus and have now begun our observance of the Easter season. In fact, Thomas, did you know that every year, the week after we hear the story of Jesus' victory over sin and death, we hear one of your stories? Yes, Christians around the world will be speaking your name today in a myriad of different tongues. But before you take this as flattery, I should probably explain something. You see, this Sunday is often known as Low Sunday. Some people joke that because the week after Easter we typically see low church attendance, that's why they call it Low Sunday. And actually, come to think of it, no one is going to be attending church this year on this day, but I'll explain more of that later. Some call today Low Sunday because they think that your refusal to believe in Christ until you had seen him with your own eyes is a low point in the gospel story, one where we see a disciple fall to doubt and despair rather than exercising their faith. Unfortunately, I feel rather duty-bound to tell you, Thomas, that lately, like in the last couple centuries or so, we church folk have given you an unfortunate moniker. We call you Doubting Thomas. And truthfully, this brings me to my reason for writing to you. I believe we owe you an apology. We have made a mistake, a few in fact, as we have a tendency to reduce your story of discipleship to this one encounter that you have with the risen Christ. And what's even more, we also have a tendency to characterize that encounter clumsily. Because when I read this story of yours, Thomas, I don't actually hear a lot of doubt. Don't get me wrong, I do not have an issue with doubting as a part of the life of one who follows Jesus. And for that matter, I don't have much reason to suspect that Jesus had an issue with it either. No, we know that doubt is not the antithesis of faith, but its partner. We understand that doubt is the condition that makes faith possible. Doubt is often the catalyst for reframing oppressive ideas or systems. It's the impetus for questioning the status quo, and it can lead us to positive change, both in ourselves and in the world. I'm not apologizing for doubt in the least, but I am apologizing to you, Thomas, because calling you the doubter just isn't fair. For one thing, it's not like this is the only moment that you appear in the Gospels. What about that time that Jesus told you all that he was going to walk through dangerous territory, to go raise a man from the dead, and you and all the other disciples were convinced that if they didn't kill him on the way, they were definitely going to kill him when they saw what he did for Lazarus? It was you who rallied the troops and declared that you would be following Jesus even to death if that's where he were to lead you. What about when Jesus told you that he was going ahead of you to prepare a place for you, and you were so adamant that you would follow him there that you all but insisted that he tell you the way? Those stories don't speak of doubt at all, but rather a certain dedication, I think. I see your courage, Thomas. I see someone who is brave enough to be all in with Jesus. You're 100% there for the journey of discipleship, wherever it might lead. And that makes me think that the relationship between you and Jesus must have been one of particular devotion and a resolute loyalty. And not just on your part either. I imagine that to follow Jesus as you did was to trust Jesus, to rely on the knowledge that he was there for you just as much as you were for him. I imagine that you built a rich friendship in which you shared authenticity and vulnerability, where a particular level of interdependence came naturally. I imagine that years of watching and listening to him must have shown you his steadfastness, his sincerity, and his fidelity to those he loved, those he came to serve. Years of getting through some of the toughest situations, opposition and occupation and oppression together, must have taught you his trustworthiness. You put your hope in him. You believed in him. And you believed in the promises that he made and the relationship that you shared. Thomas, I cannot fathom what the news of Jesus' torture and crucifixion must have done to you. I can't comprehend the grief, the fear, the helplessness that you must have felt. You must have been questioning everything. Did you begin to wonder what it all had been for? What did any of it mean if they could ultimately kill Jesus and the empire would live on? What were you to make of the promises made, of the trust, of the devotion, the loyalty, and the fidelity that characterized your relationship now that your steadfast friend was dead? If it were me, I would have been haunted by fear and maybe even anger that this person on whom I thought I could always rely and who I had thought would always be there no longer was. But then you hear this truly incredible story from your friends that they have seen the risen Christ without you. And they told you what it felt like to be in his presence again after they were sure that they never would be. You heard how they saw his wounds and heard his voice and felt his breath. They got to see him alive again. And this is why I fail to see your response to their story as doubt or as some kind of low point in the gospel. I think it's an act of trust. I think it points to a deeply faithful relationship with God. When you said that you would not believe until you saw for yourself the crucified and risen Lord, I hear you asking for what you need, what your fellow disciples had already received. I hear in your statement echoes of the psalmist and the prophets who practiced lament. I hear an adamant belief that God is alive and God is powerful. And like Habakkuk and Jeremiah and Job, you, Thomas, were willing to demand that God show up for you in the midst of your pain and your grief and your fear, just as God had promised to. You insisted that you too needed to see Jesus' wounded hands and side, to hear his voice speaking peace to you, to feel his breath on your skin. You knew that only by seeing with your own eyes would you obtain the assurance that you needed, that Jesus' death did not invalidate everything that came before it, that Jesus had not and never would abandon you. You knew that this was something you needed to understand, not just with your brain, but also with your own body, your own senses. And you knew that it is not by hearsay that we come to recognition and relationship with God, but by our own experience. Thomas, as I mentioned to you before, I am writing from the year 2020, and you wouldn't believe what's happening. We have had an outbreak of a virus called COVID-19. It is widespread, and it's become fatal in some cases. It's extremely contagious, and it has caused what we call in our age a pandemic, meaning that it's affecting the entire globe. Our world has changed dramatically in a relatively short amount of time. Our stores, schools, streets, and churches are empty as we stay put in our homes in the hope that we can reduce the number of people who will be contracting this disease. Not unlike your friends, the disciples, we too have been driven behind our own locked doors out of fear. I have a newfound appreciation for what you and Peter and James and John and the others must have felt in those days after Jesus died. I have not known isolation or disconnection or anxiety like I know it now, living in quarantine for over a month. When I read this week the story of how Jesus came among your friends and later came to you as well, saying, "Peace be with you," I thought about how desperately I would wish for Jesus to say those words to me in this unprecedented time. I wish Jesus were here to say those words, to speak to my fear and my anxiety, and to remind me, as I think he did you, that he is still there for me and he won't ever abandon me. When I hear that word of peace, I think of one of our theologians, a man whose straightforwardness I think you would appreciate, Thomas, named Martin Luther, who wrote about the peace of Christ during a plague that affected many in his own time. And he said this: "Christ's peace is not to remove us from disaster and death, but to have peace in the midst of disaster and death, knowing that the risen Christ has overcome these things." I think the world needs to hear that word of Christ's peace, Christ's promise right now. I know I do. So this note that began as a letter of apology is, I guess, turning into a letter of gratitude. You've taught me something in your witness, Thomas. You had the courage to demand that Jesus make good on his promises. You knew what you needed from God, and you had the courage to ask for it. Like the prophets and the psalmists before you, you called God to account. You demanded that God show up for you, and God did, proving that God was indeed, and is indeed, worthy of the hope that you and I have placed in him. You demanded to know God by your own experience of God. I'd like to think if you were here now, you would be pushing me to do the same. As I read your story this week, it almost seemed at times that your voice was in my ear, urging me, "Emily, you know what God can do. You know that God is alive and powerful and has made promises to be there for you, even and especially in the midst of disaster and death. It's time to demand that God make good on those promises. It's time to demand that God show up." Thomas, I think you're right. Thank you for your faithful witness, my friend, and thank you for showing me the way. Peace be with you. I'll see you on the other side. Emily.